Welcome to the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia, the world's finest collection of Edgar Allan Poe artifacts and memorabilia. Our 3 buildings of exhibits take you all the way through his life, from his childhood, represented in this building with things like his childhood bed or his sister's piano, all the way to Poe's death. Yeah, we have a whole exhibit here just about Poe's final days and death. Even have a piece of his coffin back there and a lock of his hair cut from his head just after his death. But we're not here to show you what anybody could see. We're here to take you behind the scenes. Let's start in the library. The Poe Museum's reference library is accessed regularly by students and scholars, biographers, filmmakers, anyone with an interest in Edgar Allan Poe. Because this is, after all, the place to go for all things Poe. These cases contain biographies of Poe running from Allen to Zumbach, and then books about Poe criticism, Poe bibliographies, Poe concordances. There's a section here all about Poe collections, like the one at the University of Virginia, the Lilly Library, or the Susan Jaffe Taine collection, just to name a few. There's also pieces down here that feature Poe as a character. This is all novels with Poe as a character. And then, of course, we have sections about other 19th century writers and cultural literary figures. And then a whole section about Richmond, Virginia, its architecture and history. And that puts Poe into context. So we not only have the biographies, but also works about the city that Poe called home. And that brings us to some of the other research that people do. We also have in here archives of institutional history and archives of Poe's life and works. But one of my favorite sections down here is the archive about the museum's collection. And we keep files in a lot of our pieces. This is just the file about a single daguerreotype type of Poe we have downstairs, where it came from, what its provenance is, different media coverage of it before it came to the Poe Museum, how it got here. And this is a great resource for people and a great resource for us. And in one case, we have an even bigger stack of paperwork about a letter that Poe Museum recently received. And we received it from the original recipient's great-great-great-granddaughter. And we found out from our files that 100 years ago, back in 1924, the museum actually offered her grandfather $50 for that letter. But we just waited 100 years and got it for free. So that's even better. We also have scholarly journals. And there actually are a couple Poe-specific scholarly journals, the Edgar Allan Poe Review and Poe Studies. There also used to be another one called the Poe Messenger. So we've got those different issues here. So anybody who needs to come and do research, they can conduct that research here. But we really love our archives because that's a chance to see some of these things that you're not going to find published anywhere else. You're not going to find this on the internet. You have to come and dig through the old papers to find it. But I'm not forgetting about the anthologies. We have lots and lots of Poe anthologies from roughly the 1880s until today. The anthologies from Poe's time up until about 1880, those are stored in a special collections building, but these are the later editions, or we consider them later. These aren't, 2024. These are about 1903 up here. And why are there so many editions of Poe's works? It's because they keep finding more works. They strike others from the canon. A lot of these are scholarly collections. Like this one's by Harrison, who decided he was going to compile every single essay, letter, poem, literary review, short story, all into one 16-volume set. So we've got those. Later they decided some of the ones he included weren't really the right ones, or maybe he made some editorial choices that didn't reflect what Poe intended. So there were later editions, like the Thomas Olive Mabbott editions here, or much later the Burden Pollen editions. So it's a continuing work, and they still haven't managed to come out with a complete set of everything that Poe ever did. So these are all still incomplete. This 2-volume set here is just the letters. The most recent edition of that came out in 2008, and as soon as they came out of that edition, more letters turned up. So it's already outdated, but today this is the best source of information about Poe's letters. Other than, I guess, to seeing the originals right here in the flesh or in the paper, as it were. And that brings us to illustrated editions. Our earliest illustrated edition of Poe's works dates to 3 years after Poe's death. So we store that in the special collections area. But here we have Harry Clark's illustrations from 1919, his second edition from 1923, Edmund Dulac, some of the most beautiful illustrations to Poe's works ever made. Check this out. But that's not enough. We also have David Forey's, and he's a Spanish artist. This is a pretty recent one, just within the past few years. In addition to giving us the book with his beautiful illustrations of Poe's works, he also autographed it for us. For the Poe Museum, best museum of the world. So official, right here. The Poe Museum is the best museum in the world. Or how about this one? This is Spirits of the Dead by Richard Corbin, who's a pretty big name in underground comics. He did his first comic book versions of Poe's works back in the 1970s for Creepy. And this one's 2012. So he was still at it right up until his death. And they're just some of the greatest, most dynamic comic book illustrations to Poe's works ever done. And if comics are your thing, these are boxes of Poe comic books going back to the dreaded Classics Illustrated back in 1951, all the way up until recent times. And if you want to know more about illustrations of Poe's works, down here we have several boxes of Burden Pollen's files he kept on images of Poe's works. In the late 1980s, he compiled a list, a book-length list of every single illustration that ever been done to one of Poe's works. And these are his notes. Several boxes full of his notes. But if you want to learn more about Poe's works, we also have a box here of the notes Thomas Olive Mabbott kept while compiling his edition of Poe's short stories. Remember I talked about Thomas Olive Mabbott over there. We've got his notes down here. They came to the museum by way of his widow. We've also got notes here from Agnes Bonderot Marcuson, other Poe scholars. We've got their doctoral dissertations. We've got master's theses. We've got essays that people have written about Poe. We even have unpublished essays that different people wrote about Poe from the 1850s until today. So being unpublished, you're not going to find them online or published anywhere. You have to come here to read the originals. Whatever possible, we are trying to have these things scanned, put up on the website so you can access them that way, because not everybody can get to Virginia. But for those who can, you've got a treat ahead of you. Lots of documents you can go through, and maybe, just maybe, you'll discover a few things nobody's found before. Let's take a look at our special collections now. Before we get up there, we should probably talk about chairs. The Poe Museum has a lot of chairs, from Poe's childhood homes, from his office, and some of them are on display right now, but some of them we keep here in storage until it's their turn to be out in the exhibits. And some of them date from the 1750s here, 1810s, the 1840s, and they show a wide variety of the styles of furnishings and architecture and even literature from Poe's time. So they're important to help us interpret Poe's life and works. And we also have a lot of paintings in here. including this big portrait of Poe's foster father's sister, Mary Allen, who lived in Irvine, Scotland. In fact, that's Irvine in the background of her portrait. And why is that important to us? Because when Poe was 6 years old, his foster parents took him with them to Irvine, Scotland. From there, they went on to London, England. He spent 5 years of his childhood in Europe. And I think that left an indelible impression on him, especially and importantly in his literature. So works like this and some of our European furniture help us interpret that period of Poe's life. And it's also a pretty impressive painting. So as I mentioned, when we do remodel everything, this is going back on display for everybody to see, but for now, it's in storage, along with some other paintings. And I could show you all those, but I'm going to show you some of the really good stuff now. During Poe's lifetime, most of his works did not appear in book form. He only printed a few books, 4 volumes of poetry, 2 collections of short stories. Most of his works appeared in magazines and newspapers. So the Poe Museum has a big collection of the first printings of his various works. This is an opportunity for scholars to see the original printing before Poe altered it, made corrections, changes. He often changed things several times before it reached the final stage just before his death. So here we have the American Museum with the first printing of Ligeia, or the American Review with the first printing from the February 1845 issue of The Raven. Or how about down here, Burden's Gentleman's Magazine, a magazine that Poe himself edited, with the first printing of The Fall of the House of Usher. Next to it here, Graham's Magazine, another one he edited in Philadelphia, with the first printing of the first detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And it goes on and on and on. We've got the first printing here of The Telltale Heart from the Boston Pioneer. So this really is a place to see the evolution of Poe's works. As you see him reprint his works in different magazines, you can see the little editorial changes he made. So in some cases, we have complete runs of different magazines. Other times we have individual issues, which we store separately down there. So this is another great resource to see what the story looked like right after Poe wrote it. But sure, we have a lot of these magazines, but the place he began his career in journalism was right here in Richmond. There's a magazine called the Southern Literary Messenger. So check this out. Well, here it is. 2 complete sets of the Southern Literary Messenger, a magazine that ran from 1834 until 1864. It became the most popular journal in the South, largely because of Poe's short stories and poems and his essays he wrote for the magazine. And this particular setup here belonged to Thomas Nelson Page, who was a novelist popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. Down here, we've got ones that belong to Poe collector John Wooster Robertson, and another set down there. So because they vary in quality, you can consult different sets and see if there's any printing errors, and if a particular issue has bad condition problems, you can check out another one that might be in better condition. And sometimes scholars search here to find typographical marks that don't translate well into later editions of Poe's works, and to try to really get a good sense of how the stories looked when Poe wrote them. And over the years, since Poe wrote so many editorials and book reviews for the magazine, they also try to learn a lot about him by reading those book reviews, reading those editorials, and finding out which ones he wrote, which ones he didn't. He didn't always sign them. So there's still ongoing research about Poe and the Southern Literary Messenger. Let's check out some of his books, though. On the way to the books, I should point out that we have lots of newspapers. And these aren't just newspapers to which Poe made contributions. There's also newspapers in which Poe printed the prospectus for a proposed magazine. But there's a lot of newspapers here with notices of Poe's parents. They were professional actors. So anytime they went on stage, there were notices, there were reviews. So we have a large collection that helps track the career of Poe's parents. And we also have something very special right down here. In addition to all the prints and photographs, we've got something a little bit unique. It's a museum in itself. Let's check it out. A lot of people come to the Poe Museum or contact us because they want genealogical information. They heard that their grandmother or great-grandmother or grandfather is somehow related to Edgar Allan Poe. So they check with us and they consult family trees here, or in this case, Poe Family Bible. And yeah, we had this whole thing conserved, and all the genealogical information here has been digitized, but it's got a lot of great information about births, deaths, weddings, and even a diagram here of the Poe family burial plot up in Baltimore. Right there. We also have a lot of correspondence from people in Poe's life, including a file here of Rufus W. Griswold. So this is all Griswold letters. We have about 50 of these in all filed away here. These are being transcribed right now for inclusion on our website. So you can search through not only the genealogical information, but also Rufus Griswold's correspondence. And why do you want to know about Rufus Griswold? Because he couldn't stand Poe. They hated each other. And after Poe died, Griswold was responsible for compiling the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe. He was Poe's literary executor. He also wrote the first major biography of Poe and portrayed Poe as a madman, drunkard, womanizing, opium addict, a horrible, despicable, evil person with no morals. And that's the image that stuck. So by learning more about Griswold and more about the stories that Griswold told about Poe, we can start to chip away at the myth of Poe and get back to the real historical figure. And here's another cool piece. This is the autograph album of Lucy Dorothea Henry. And who's that? That's Patrick Henry. You know, the Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death guy. It's his granddaughter, who was born about 1822, grew up near Lynchburg, Virginia, and early on she decided she loved poetry and she wanted to contact poets, write for their autographs. Before you know it, she had autographs in her collection here from writers like Charles Dickens, Washington Irving, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, William Cullen Bryant, Nathaniel Hawthorne's in here too, but also political figures. Think every U.S. president from the first John Adams all the way up to Franklin Pierce. And a lot of these are letters directly addressed to her, saying what an honor it is to comply with this flattering request from the granddaughter of the great patriot, Patrick Henry. But the reason this is at the Poe Museum is because 3 of these pieces are Poe documents. She got an original letter from Edgar Allan Poe where he writes that it's his pleasure to comply with a very flattering request for her autograph. We've got that letter. And we also have 2 manuscripts that are included in here. She wrote to one of the editors of a magazine where Poe used to work, the Southern Literary Messenger, and he sent her a couple Poe essays, and she glued them into her album. They're not glued into the album anymore. They've been taken out, they've been conserved, and they're all stored separately. But in recent years, we've digitized this whole thing, scanned every page, every document, and it turns out there are something like 400 different individual documents in this one album. This album is a museum in itself. You've got things like a U.S. passport signed by James Monroe. You've got a letter from Washington Irving to U.S. Senator John Randolph of Roanoke. He was a very famous Virginia senator. You've even got a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Patrick Henry back when they still liked each other. So this is a who's who of American literature and a great piece just to have. We're lucky that we were entrusted with this. So we're trying to get the whole thing scanned, the whole thing up there, and it's online on our website now in our searchable collections database. But we've got more than just this. Check it over this way. So these are the first editions. things like his 1829 book, Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems, or here's one of my favorites. This is 1831. Poe's 22 years old. It's called Poems, and it was published with subscriptions sold to the cadets at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Poe was a cadet there, so his fellow cadets loved him so much they chipped in to help him get this cheap little book published, thinking it was going to be hilarious. It was going to be a bunch of funny verses ridiculing their commanding officers. That's what he made his name for while he's at West Point. They thought he was a funny guy. When they got it, it was a bunch of poetry about death, like the sleeper. Oh, the lady sleeps soft around her, may the worms creep. So the cadet who owned this, Ben Harden, wrote, "This book is a damn cheat. All that fills 120 pages could have been compiled in 35. And we're lucky this survived. Apparently, his fellow cadets threw most of their copies in the Hudson River just to get rid of them. They were so angry with Poe. Fortunately, he'd already been kicked out of West Point by then, so they couldn't really take their aggressions out on him, so they punished the book instead. And this is just one of only a few surviving copies. We also have some of his lesser-known works, like the Conchologist's first book. Yeah, it's a book about seashells. When he was falling on hard times, needed some extra money, he basically wrote the introduction for a book about seashells. And you see right there, it has seashells in the cover. And unfortunately for him, he did this work for hire. So he was paid a flat fee of $50. But it turned out to be his best-selling book during his lifetime. So it went through multiple editions within the next few years, and he didn't get any royalties for any of those extra printings. He just got his initial $50. And to make matters worse, he published this one the following year called Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, Poe's first collection of short stories. Didn't sell nearly as well as the Seashell book. So it must have been kind of embarrassing to have your bestseller be a seashell book. So by the time of the third edition, he had the publishers take his name off the title page. So we've got the first, the second, and the third edition, the one without his name on it. But we also have other big hits like The Raven and Other Poems, or Tales of Edgar A. Poe, the first collection of detective stories. I really like this one here. This is Mesmerism in Articula Mortis. It's a little pamphlet published in 1846 in London. And it's Poe's supposedly true account of mesmerizing a man at the moment of death to keep his mind alive after his body was dead. And they kept this guy in a mesmeric trance for months after his death. When he finally woke up from his trance, he just dissolved into a pool of goo before their very eyes. And people thought that was a true story. Even after Poe said, no, it's just a hoax, I made the whole thing up, they wouldn't believe him. So this is a London printing in which it was reprinted as truth. And there's even a little preface that says, yes, everybody in America knows this is true, so it must be true. We also have some fine association copies. Check this one out. This is Xenosius. It's an 1845 book that Poe gave as a gift to a young girl, and he signed it right there to her. And we actually have two Poe Association copies, two books that Poe signed and gave as gifts to young girls. And sometimes the books do go on display, but when they are on display, we only keep them on there for so long before they have to be rotated back off of display and here into the darkness. And these are gift books, which sort of annual anthologies that contain the first printings of different Poe stories. There's the collected works of Poe. And there's also books that are owned by other people connected with him. This is a copy of Poe's Complete Works Volume 3, signed by Marie Louise Hawden, who is the subject of Poe's poems To Marie Louise and To MLS. So that's her book. It came to the Poe Museum by way of her youngest sister. But you probably want to see some manuscripts, right? I'll bring out some of those. Okay, we've got books. We also have photographs, lots of photographs, including one of the most important daguerreotypes of Edgar Allan Poe. That's actually on display right now. What about Poe's sister? This is a rare, there's only two of these that we know of, and we've got both of them. This is a tintype photograph of Poe's little baby sister, Rosalie. She's a little bit older in this picture, but she outlived him by quite a bit. She taught at a girls' school here in Richmond, so she held a steady job. She taught art and penmanship. And here's another photograph of her. This one is a little CDV, and we only know of one copy of this one, and you'll never guess where that is. Right here. And this was published in 1919, you can see right there on the back, and since then remained in the family until it came here back in the 1990s. You've probably all heard of the photographer Matthew Brady. This is a little CDV of Poe that he issued from his studio in the 1860s. And even on the back it says it's from the Matthew Brady studio. And the provenance of this is pretty interesting. It came from Poe's sister. And after the Civil War, Poe's sister fell on hard times. She wasn't teaching anymore, and she made extra money by selling photographs of her famous brother on the street corners in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Richmond. So this is one that can be tied directly back to Poe's sister. We also have plenty of other photos of people from Poe's life, including enemies like Thomas Dunn English. We also have painted portraits of people like Rufus W. Griswold, the guy who wrote his first biography after he died. So definitely have lots of visual references. In fact, we have a whole file in our archives just of portraits of Poe. Often the 8x10 glossy portraits of Poe, engravings, CDVs. So we've got a large collection of Poe iconography, but also pictures of all the other people in his life. And it's been a great resource to biographers over the years. And if you look at a lot of the Poe biographies, and you look closely in the photo credits, a lot of those photos came from right here. But this is something I really like to show you. Naturally, we have a collection of Edgar Allan Poe letters and manuscripts, and this is one that Poe wrote shortly after his marriage to Charles Ellis here in Richmond. Ellis had been Poe's foster father's business partner, but Poe's foster father had died just 2 years earlier, so Poe's asking him for a credit of $50 at his dry goods store. I'm pretty sure he didn't get the $50. So you've got all sorts of letters like that, including we've got one recently from Poe to Washington Irving. It's on display right now, but this is Poe sort of at the beginning of his career. He's 30 years old. He's about to issue his first collection of short stories, and he's writing to the established author Washington Irving, who'd written, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow 19 years earlier, and asking him, can you write a book blurb for me? They didn't call them book blurbs back then. They just said, can you give me an opinion that I can use in the advertisements in the front of my book? They had a nicer way of saying it back then. And then for manuscripts, we've got a good collection of those. This one is a portion of Poe's manuscript to Francis Sargent Osgood. And Francis Sargent Osgood was a pretty popular poet in Poe's day and somebody he knew personally. They were friends. They wrote sort of flirtatious poetry back and forth. And he wrote a long essay, an appreciation of her that he contributed to the Southern Literary Messenger. After Poe died, the owner of the Messenger gave away fragments of the manuscript to friends. One fragment he gave to Lucy Dorothea Henry, who owned that autograph album I showed you earlier. And that's been here since 1928. This fragment we just got this year. So the other one is the end of the essay, and this is the last few paragraphs of that same essay, together again after all those years. And this one is particularly interesting to me. It's a letter written by William Maxwell to the Southern Literary Messenger. And Poe was the editor of the magazine, so Maxwell wrote to him submitting some of his poems. This is Sacred Song. And as Poe was sitting there, he seemed to like Maxwell's poetry, and he actually published one of them in the August issue of the Messenger that year. But about this time, he said, Sacred Song is pretty good. I wonder if I could do better. So he grabbed the first piece of paper he could find and jotted down his own poem right here, Spiritual Song. It was never completed, never published during Poe's lifetime. And this letter with Poe's little poem right there was found in a little secret compartment in Poe's writing desk long after his death. And that just came to the Poe Museum a few years ago. Its existence has been known for a long time, but there's a collector, Susan Jaffe Tain, a major literary collector, who donated that to the Poe Museum. And she's been looking out for us in the last several years. She's been on our board for a long time, and now is really contributing a lot of her collection to us to help strengthen weak areas in our archives and collection. So that's just a brief overview of what we have here at the museum. In addition to the paintings, the photographs, the manuscripts, the letters, the first editions, first printings, newspapers, we also have sculptures. A lot of those are on display, so that's why we didn't really put them on the tour here. And we even have a garden. And it's full of Poe pieces. Yeah, I mean, bricks from different places that Poe lived or worked were incorporated into the garden. The museum opened back in 1922 with a lot of these pieces from Poe places all around it, including ivy from Poe's mother's grave, which is still growing there today. You just can't get rid of ivy. So that's just a very brief overview of some of the things that the Poe Museum has in storage that you don't usually get a chance to see. There's plenty of important Poe pieces on display right now, including the engagement ring that Poe gave to his last fiancée just before his death, or that very famous daguerreotype of Poe taken just 1 year before he died, or Poe's socks. Yes, we have Poe's socks. They're on display in the death room there. So be sure to come down to Richmond, check it out for yourself. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And I forgot to mention, we also have a pet cat, and his name is Edgar.